Egypt's President Sisi welcomes his South Korean counterpart in Cairo for talks on bilateral ties. European foreign ministers say any plan to end the Ukraine conflict must include both Ukrainians and Europeans. And the UN General Assembly adopts Egypt's resolution affirming Palestinians' right to self-determination with support from 164 states. The news in detail. President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and First Lady Intisar al-Sisi have welcomed South Korean President Lee Jae-myung and his wife in Cairo with talks covering the full spectrum of bilateral ties. Following their talks at the presidential palace, the two leaders witnessed the signing of a memorandum of understanding on cultural cooperation signed by Egypt's Culture Minister Ahmed Fouad Henno and South Korea's Minister of Culture and Science. They also attended the signing of an MOU on education inked on the Egyptian side by Education Minister Mohammed Abdel Latif. The agreements aim to deepen cultural exchange and support joint programs in schooling and technical education as part of a broader upgrade in Egypt-South Korea's relations. Egypt's Prime Minister Mustafa Madbouli says this November has brought a series of major milestones for Egypt, from the opening of the Grand Egyptian Museum to progress on the Dabaa nuclear plant, which he says will save up to $3 billion a year. Speaking at a news conference, Prime Minister Madbouli said Egypt is turning a new bright page with the start of the Dabaa nuclear project, describing it as the fulfillment of a national dream that has existed since the mid-20th century. He said the plant is expected to save between $2 and $3 billion annually once fully operational, thanks to reduced fuel imports. Madbouli added that major international companies he meets consistently ask for land in the Suez Canal economic zone, reflecting strong investor interest in Egypt's strategic location and infrastructure. Egypt's new administrative capital is preparing to host the IRC Expo 2025 next December, the first global platform to showcase research solutions under the patronage of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and opened by Prime Minister Mustafa Madbouli. Organizers say IRC Expo 2025 will position Egypt as a global launchpad for innovation, bringing together governments, researchers, companies, and investors to match real-world challenges with cutting-edge research outputs. The event is set to feature more than 150 international participants from around 50 countries, with 35 global pavilions, 15 keynote speakers, and 27 subsectors of innovation. The expo will see international agreements signed and advanced solutions launched in fields such as health industry, artificial intelligence, energy, environment, agriculture, food security, and deep tech. Egyptians abroad begin voting tonight in the second phase of the 2025 parliamentary elections, with the first polling station opening in New Zealand and the last closing in California. Polling for the second phase of the House of Representatives elections kicks off for expatriates at 10 p.m. Cairo local time, as Egypt's embassy in Wellington opens its doors at 9 a.m. local time, ahead of 139 embassies and consulates in 117 countries over Friday and Saturday, 21st and 22nd November. Voting at each mission runs from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. local time, supervised by diplomatic staff and foreign ministry employees. Balloting inside Egypt will follow on 24th and 25th November, with official results due on the 2nd of December and a possible runoff for overseas voters on 15th and 16th December, ahead of a domestic runoff on 17 and 18 December if required. Now we move on to the latest developments in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. European foreign ministers have emphasized that any plan to end the conflict with Ukraine must involve both Ukrainians and Europeans. That comes as the US has proposed a framework requiring Kiev to cede territory, limit its military, and surrender some weapons. Such terms would constitute a significant setback for Ukraine amid Russian advances in the east and a domestic corruption scandal, which recently led to the dismissal of the energy and justice ministers. The White House has declined to comment on the proposed plan. EU foreign policy chief
What we as Europeans have always supported is a long-lasting and just peace, and we welcome any efforts to achieve that. Of course, for any plan to work, it needs Ukrainians and Europeans on board. So this is very clear.
German Foreign Minister Johann Wadephul has emphasized that any ceasefire and peace negotiations for Ukraine must actively involve the Ukrainian government and all European nations. Wadephul stated that discussions on Ukraine's peaceful development cannot proceed without Kiev's participation and European inclusion. He stressed that the essential first step is an end to Russia's conflict with Ukraine, noting this is the only path towards a reliable peace. He responded to reports of a US proposal requiring Ukraine to cede eastern territories in exchange for security guarantees, underscoring that Ukrainian sovereignty must remain central. And French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot has urged immediate ceasefire talks, stressing territory and security negotiations and highlighting Russia as the primary obstacle to peace.
Discussions should start with a ceasefire on the contact line that allow for negotiation on the question of territories, on the question of security guarantees. We have said that, the US have said that, President Trump has said that, and Ukrainians are ready for this. The only obstacle to such ordered discussions so far is Vladimir Putin.
Meanwhile, Dutch Foreign Minister David van Wiel has stated that the Netherlands has not been involved in the peace plan and is unaware of Ukraine's role. He emphasized that any peace plan must have Ukraine's full support as it concerns Ukrainian territory and sovereignty. He added that without Ukraine's endorsement, European backing cannot be secured. The Dutch Foreign Minister stressed that Ukraine's participation is essential for legitimacy and successful implementation, and that Europeans will only support a plan that fully respects Ukraine's decision and territorial integrity.
Ukraine has been in this plan, but obviously for us it is important that whatever peace plan is on the table.
Hungarian Foreign Minister Peter Szijjártó said that payments to Ukraine should have been halted immediately by Brussels and that a full financial audit should have been demanded to determine how European taxpayers' money was used. He stated that global media reports indicate the operation of what he described as a corrupt system and war mafia in Ukraine. It was criticized as insane and scandalous that the European Commission President requested an additional 100 billion euros for Ukraine without addressing these concerns or calling for financial accountability.
It's crazy that the President of the European Commission sends a letter to the Member States to give another 100 billion euros.
Swedish Foreign Minister Maria Malmer Stenergaard has stated that peace cannot be achieved without Ukraine and Europe being present at the negotiating table. She added that despite numerous discussions about various dialogue formats, Sweden's plan remains centered on 2 points: continued support for Ukraine and increased pressure on Russia. She emphasized that these steps are viewed as essential to shifting the balance so that Russia becomes willing to engage in genuine peace talks, as it was said that Moscow is currently unwilling to do so.
Able to change the equation so that Russia will want to come to the table, because it's quite obvious that Russia is not willing to have serious.
Polish Foreign Minister Władysław Sikorski has stated that peace efforts are commended, but Europe is recognized as the primary actor and main supporter of Ukraine. He emphasized that Europe's security is considered to be at stake, and it was insisted that consultation with European authorities is expected in decisions regarding the situation. The remarks of Sikorski highlighted that Europe's role and security interests must be acknowledged and taken into account in all relevant diplomatic and strategic efforts concerning Ukraine.
We commend peace efforts, but Europe is the main pair, the main supporter of Ukraine, and it's of course Europe's security that's at stake, so we expect to be.
And turning to Iran, where nuclear pressures, regional maneuvering and diplomatic strains continue to shape the country's role on the international stage.
We're trying to make a deal so that there's no destruction and death.
In Iran, tensions over its nuclear program, a tightening domestic crackdown and deepening economic hardship are converging, even as Tehran keeps projecting regional influence through allied groups across the Middle East. Iran is facing renewed friction with international inspectors over its nuclear activities, while signaling only limited openness to fresh talks under tougher sanctions. At home, rights groups say authorities are combining a slight easing of social restrictions in some public spaces with a harsher clampdown on dissent and a rise in executions. The economy remains under severe pressure, with inflation and shortage weighing on households. At the same time, Tehran continues to back allied movements in the region, using their actions to maintain leverage on Israel and Western powers despite its own internal and economic strains. Iran's invite to the UN nuclear watchdog says a new IAEA resolution will have a negative impact on cooperation over its nuclear programs, calling the move politically motivated by the United States and European powers. speaking after the Board of Governors adopted a resolution urging Tehran to grant access and provide more information on its nuclear sites. Iran's ambassador to the IAEA, Reza Najafi, said the decision was driven by politics rather than safeguards concerns. He accused the United States and the E3 group of Germany, France and the United Kingdom of sponsoring the text, while one of them, in his words, is the main perpetrator of aggression against Iran's safeguarded nuclear facilities. Najafi warned the move would damage cooperation with the agency as the standoff over Iran's nuclear activities deepens.
And E3, indeed, one of the sponsors of the resolution is the main.
The UN Nuclear Watchdog's board has passed a resolution urging Iran to grant inspectors access to bombed nuclear sites and explain its highly enriched uranium stockpile, prompting warnings of retaliation from Tehran. The IAEA's 35-nation Board of Governors approved a US-European draft resolution calling on Iran to quickly cooperate with inspectors, reopen sites hit in June strikes, and clarify the status of uranium enriched up to 60% close to weapons grade. Iran, which says its program is peaceful, has warned the move could harm its cooperation with the agency. Western diplomats say the aim is to restore broader monitoring and curb activities they fear could shorten Iran's breakout time. Iran has released a Marshall Islands flag tanker and its 21 crew days after seizing the vessel in Gulf waters in its first such move in more than a year. The product tanker Talara was allowed to leave Iranian waters on Wednesday with all 21 crew members safe, according to its managers, who said the ship is now free to resume normal operations. Iran's Revolutionary Guards had diverted the tanker last week off the country's southern coast without publicly explaining the seizure. The release comes amid renewed tensions over Tehran's nuclear program and Western criticism of its regional activities, but may be seen as a limited de-escalatory step in the vital shipping lanes.
And then, of course, we have the host tonight, and I just want to thank you very much. It was a reason we chose Egypt, because you were very helpful, and very, very helpful. Everybody wanted to have this, but we really thought it was appropriate, and you are a great leader. And he's a fantastic man and a fantastic general, by the way. But he's a great president, and I want to thank Egypt and all of your representatives for treating us all so well. Thank you very much.
The UN General Assembly has overwhelmingly adopted Egypt's annual resolution affirming the Palestinian people's right to self-determination, with support from 164 states. Egypt, submitting the text on behalf of the Islamic group, welcomed the broad endorsement, which reflects firm international backing for the Palestinians' inalienable rights, including establishing an independent state. Egypt reaffirmed its steadfast commitment to supporting these rights and coordinating with regional and international partners. It also stressed the importance of implementing President Trump's peace plan and UN Security Council Resolution 2803 to secure a ceasefire, advance reconstruction, and pave the way for a just political settlement. In southern Gaza, grieving families gathered at Nasser Hospital to mourn relatives killed in the new Israeli airstrikes as Israel and Hamas trade accusations over breaching a fragile, weeks-long ceasefire. At Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis, devastated Palestinians wept over bodies laid out in crowded corridors and courtyards after fresh Israeli airstrikes on the Gaza Strip. Relatives clutched white-shrouded victims and condemned what they called repeated attacks despite a weeks-long ceasefire meant to halt the two-year war. Israel and Hamas each accuse each other of violating the truce terms, with the latest casualties fueling fears the fragile post could collapse and plunge civilians back into full-scale fighting. Hamas says Israeli forces are pushing the so-called Yellow Line westward inside Gaza in violation of the ceasefire and President Donald Trump's peace maps as new Israeli airstrikes hit the Strip. Hamas spokesperson Hazem Qasem accused the Israeli troops of working daily to move the Yellow Line further west, saying that breaches the ceasefire and the maps attached to President Trump's Gaza plan. The Yellow Line marks the boundary behind which Israeli forces were meant to pull back under the agreement. Gaza's Civil Defense Agency said Israel launched fresh airstrikes on the territory, stoking fears the weeks-long truce could erode on the ground even as diplomatic efforts continue to stabilize it. In Gaza City, Palestinians have inspected heavy damage after an Israeli strike hit the Hamas-run Ministry of Endowment, shattering nearby buildings and sending debris across surrounding streets. Footage from Gaza City shows residents walking through rubble and twisted metal after an Israeli strike on the Hamas-run Ministry of Endowment. Windows were blown out and offices left in ruins, with fragments of concrete and glass scattered across nearby homes and shops. Locals say the blast rocked the neighborhood and sparked panic among families sheltering in already damaged buildings. Israel has not immediately commented on the specific target as strikes continue to hit government facilities and residential areas across the Strip despite the fragile ceasefire. Injured Palestinians are being rushed to Nasser Hospital after new Israeli strikes on Gaza killed 27 people in one of the deadliest attacks since last month's truce came into force, according to officials in the Strip. Ambulances and private cars poured into Nasser Hospital in southern Gaza, carrying wounded Palestinians after a fresh wave of Israeli strikes that local authorities say left at least 27 people dead. Medics treated patients in crowded corridors as relatives searched for loved ones. Officials call it one of the deadliest attacks since the truce took effect last month. The escalation comes as Israel also reports a series of strikes on Hezbollah targets in Lebanon, testing a nearly year-long ceasefire along the northern front and raising fears of a wider regional flare-up. In southern Israel, personnel are working inside a joint civil-military coordination center set up by the United States and its allies to oversee the fragile Gaza truce. Footage from Kiryat Gat shows staff at the civil-military coordination center of the CMCC monitoring screens and handling communications as they track implementation of the ceasefire in Gaza. The U.S.-led command hub brings together American officers and aligned partners to coordinate with Israeli authorities and international actors on aid flows, security arrangements, and incidents that could threaten the truce. Officials say the center is designed to keep channels open and reduce the risk that local violations escalate back into full-scale fighting.
كل المستهدفين هن مدنيين.
وضع شيء مرعب، شيء بخوف.
Lebanese Prime Minister Nawaf Salam says Beirut plans to seek U.S. support to open a negotiating track with Israel, even as he accuses Israel of failing to respect the ceasefire terms in the south. Prime Minister Nawaf Salam said Lebanon intends to request American backing to launch a negotiation path with Israel, stressing that any talks must be tied to security and stability along the border. He noted that despite Israel's lack of full compliance with the ceasefire agreement, disarmament plans in the south are moving in the right direction. Salam added that the Lebanese army is expanding its deployment in southern areas, particularly those close to the border with Israel, as part of efforts to reinforce state authority and prevent further escalation. Lebanese Speaker Nabih Berri is calling on the government to request an urgent UN Security Council session over escalating Israeli attacks in the south and what he says are growing violations of Resolution 1701. In remarks reported by Lebanese media, Nabih Berri warned that Israeli forces are intensifying strikes on civilians, including children and students, and said Lebanon is fully committed to Resolution 1701 and the cessation of hostilities deal. He urged the government to keep filling compliance and now to seek an emergency Security Council meeting to condemn Israeli violations. Berri's appeal follows a UNIFIL survey finding that a concrete wall built by Israel crosses the blue line and blocks access to more than 4,000 square meters of Lebanese land, a move the UN says breaches Lebanon's sovereignty and Resolution 1701. Israel has carried out new air and drone strikes on southern Lebanon, killing at least one person and wounding several others, including school children, as tensions with Hezbollah escalate despite a year-old ceasefire. Lebanon's health ministry and state media says an Israeli strike on a car in the southern village of Tiri killed one man and injured 11 people, including students on a nearby school bus and their driver. The attack came hours after Israeli raids on several towns and on the Ain al-Hilwa Palestinian refugee camp near Sidon, where at least 30 people were killed. Israel says it is targeting Hezbollah infrastructure and preventing the group from rebuilding its capabilities near the border, while Beirut accuses it of repeatedly violating the November 2024 ceasefire. Well, that brings us to the end of our news bulletin. But before we wrap up, here is a recap of the top stories making headlines for this hour. Egypt's President Sisi welcomes his South Korean counterpart in Cairo for talks on bilateral ties. European foreign ministers say any plan to end the Ukraine conflict must include both Ukrainians and Europeans. And the UN General Assembly adopts Egypt's resolution affirming Palestinians' right to self-determination with support from 164 states. For more stories and live updates, follow Qnews on YouTube, Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok at QNewsEGY. All of us here, many thanks for watching and stay tuned for more news and analysis on Qnews.